And I'm going to talk on this first slide for a good 3 minutes.
Yeah, no worries. I love these closed captions. This is great.
I thought so too. It was even punctuating pretty well.
Yeah, and we're gonna get a full transcript at the end of it too.
That's awesome. You know, you could write a book with those transcripts if they're copy pastable.
Yeah, yeah, they will be. They'll be full text.
I mean, we could take all of
The
those
other thing,
seriously and edit them down a little bit and publish a little booklet.
it's not a bad idea. The other thing I want to do eventually is figure out how to do this in a way that rather than doing it through a Zoom meeting, that we're doing it through like open broadcasting and we're streaming a la Twitch so that we can really record it beautifully instead of recording it the way we are. Because
I don't
it's
know
not,
anything about it.
like I know enough to know that it's possible, but like I could do if it were just me and I was the only talking head, it would be easy. But I don't know how to do it where we have two different talking heads.
Uh-huh.
That's more complicated. We might need Zoom webinars, and then maybe we'll be able to do it. Or we would have to feed it, like I would have to point your computer to my URL and then
Uh-huh.
feed my stream back into Zoom. So I might need to poke some friends of mine who know about this shit because I don't.
Yeah, or maybe it's just gonna have to be post-production because we're so far apart.
Right. In which case, you'll just have to record locally, and I'll just have to record locally.
Uh-huh.
Who knows? Or we won't have, or we won't be able to do it with a live one that will just record a discussion, and we won't have an audience. We only have 3 in the waiting room, and it's 8 o'clock. I did email everybody, didn't I?
I don't know. I got an email from you, I think,
Yeah.
yesterday or something. Some people told me they were gonna miss a little bit of it. A lot of people asked me if we were recording it, actually.
Yeah. Oh, we're getting a bunch coming in. We got 6 in the waiting room now, or 5.
Well, if you want to let them in, I'll tell my story.
6. There we go. Let's hold off on telling stories. We can kibitz for a little bit, and then.
Okay.
In her room.
Hello, welcome everybody. We'll start in a few minutes.
And while we wait, if anybody has any questions, feel free to type them in the chat room. Let us know if you need anything. And we're still waiting on a couple of people. We are expecting about 15, I think. So we're gonna give it a little bit before we start.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
Thank you. This is sunset from my roof 2 weeks ago.
Cool.
It is weird that when I wear a black T-shirt, I look a little bit like Steve Jobs with this background. It's like, super clean head and the black turtleneck, but with the gray shirt, it's a little better. And then you guys don't have to look at my closet.
I can't see the chat while I do these. You'll
Yeah,
pretty
no,
much have
I'll
to do everything.
I'll handle it. There we go. Somebody in the chat. Yes, Sonia, I am recording. So I will send out links once everything gets rendered. If you want to take a look at it, it's going to be a private YouTube link. But if you want to take a look at the end of the end of the webinar, absolutely, I'll send it your way.
We have the closed captioning by request if anyone wants to use that.
Yeah, I think it should be visible to you guys automatically, but if it's not, down at the bottom there are options to turn it on.
We're going to go again next Wednesday, Jake?
I don't know. I'm not sure. I will say while we're waiting to start, more than almost any other time in the last week, I've gotten messages about reading comp, and you know, if other people who are here today are equally baffled by reading comprehension these last couple of weeks as we prep for October and November, I think putting together something on reading comprehension for next week or the week after would be worthwhile for sure. So if that's a thing that people want and are eager to have, oh, Julia says yes, please.
I got
yes,
one.
please.
Yeah, I'm in. I don't have anything planned Wednesday. I've made my schedule free Wednesdays specifically to do this.
Awesome. I will confirm, but I'm pretty sure next week on Wednesday we can do something on reading comp.
All right. You know, the 2007 practice test has been useful source of material for the webinars. So maybe we'll just stick with that and use those passages to kind of discuss our methodologies.
Yeah, and actually, you know, if people while we wait to start, we've got almost everybody in, so we'll start in a minute or two. But if you've got the chance before we start, go and grab the June 2007 test from LSAT, because that's the one we're using today, and then we'll talk about sort of what to do in prep for a reading comp section.
Yeah, it's free. You just Google June 2007 LSAT. It's like the first Google result.
Yeah.
Every question we're going to review today, except for some of the really simple stuff at the beginning, will come from that test, and we'll tell you it's all from section 2. We'll tell you which question number as we go.
Absolutely. All right. I think we've got about 10 people in, 10 people in, so we can probably get started, and then we'll share the link around to the video to everybody afterwards if they miss anything.
Okay, cool. All right, well, welcome everybody. I'm Keith, and I'm going to start the presentation today. This is a presentation on circuit logic. Circuit logic is a visual diagramming method that I conceived for logical reasoning, and I shared it with Jake, and he's been really helpful in fleshing this out and coming up with something that's workable and not just some figment of my imagination. So what I'd like to do is tell you guys quickly how I came up with the idea and start to break it down kind of from its inception, so we can take small steps toward understanding it, because I think it is somewhat of a complex strategy, and if we show you the final result up front, it'll be hard to get you on board. So I want to get you up to speed. What kind of drove me to create this was that when I started teaching LSAT many years ago, I noticed very quickly that I was helping people in logic games very much, and then not helping them so much on logical reasoning, and then even less on reading comprehension. And one explanation that's frequently thrown out there is, well, people come and they don't have any knowledge of logic games, so of course you can help them. But what's interesting is that not only did I get them up to the levels of their reading comp or their LR score, I would get them well surpassed that. So that wasn't really the complete explanation, that they just didn't know how to do the logic games. And I was showing them how. I was showing them how to do it so well that they could actually do that better than the skills they had been doing longer, like reading comprehension and evaluating arguments. So that really fascinated me, and I tried to explore what is the reason for that. And one explanation that I latched onto was the visual nature of the strategies that we're teaching for logic games. I mean, just the fact that we call them games is interesting to me. We think it's fun. A lot of people view reading comprehension or LR as very mentally exhausting. And so it seems to me that if we can start to incorporate the visual cortex and think about these things on a more visual level, maybe we can make it a little more intuitive. That plus a couple other connections that I made years later as an LSAT teacher helped me come up with this. And then, as I mentioned, Jake's been extremely helpful in putting it all together. So let's start talking now about logic games. Next slide, please, Jake. All right, it's a strange place to start because this is a method for LR, but as I mentioned, the whole thing was driven by observations that I was making about logic games and how we were helping people there. The other observation that occurred to me was that a lot of the skills that were useful on logic games translated right over to LR, and it just wasn't really apparent to me when I first started studying this. So let's think about how logic games work for just a minute. On the logic games section, the game itself provides the rules, and then the deductions arise typically when the rules overlap. That's an observation that I made. In fact, one of the instructions I give to my students is look for rules that have overlapping variables. So for example, if we're talking about an order game, we might have a rule that says A must precede B, A comes before B, and B comes before C. Pretty typical sequence clues. And the way that we would deal with this is by coming up with a visual symbol. Next slide. And so this is the typical way to symbolize these kind of clues, the letter and then some symbol in between indicating the relationship, A dash B, A before B, B dash C, B before C. But what's interesting about these rules is that both of them contain the variable B. And therefore, if we combine the two rules, we come up with this sequence, A is before B is before C. And now that the variable B has done the work of combining the two clues for us, we can remove it completely from the diagram and see the relationship between A and C directly, right? A has to be before C is a valid deduction that we can draw from the rules A is before B and B is before C. But those rules don't directly make the comparison between A and C, right? Simple logic games deduction. I doubt that any of you have problems making that kind of deduction. Now, let's see how that applies to logical reasoning. Logical reasoning, I find it to be almost unfair that there's an assumption on the LR section that LSAC doesn't tell you about. When they say, how is this argument flawed or why is it flawed? The assumption that they're making is that there's only one kind of valid logic and that any deviation from that is a flaw in the thinking. So what kind of logic do they think is valid? It's deductive logic, which is exactly the same kind of logic that you use to work out logic games. Right? This is how I started putting the whole connection together, that even though we're talking about verbal arguments, we're still operating in the same world where we're thinking about proofs, not about persuasion. All right, so on the logic game section, deductions require the rules of the game. You can't make a deduction if they don't give you any rules. In an argument, the rules are the premises of the argument. The major premises in particular tend to state generalities that serve as the rule for the game. And one of the mistakes that students make is they want to debate the premises of the argument, but what the section wants you to do is treat them more like the rules of a logic game where you don't get to debate them. You only get to debate what inferences or deductions you can draw from them. And so that leads to my last point on this slide, which is that a properly drawn conclusion is one that is deduced from the premises in the same way that a logic game deduction must be proven from the rules. That's the only kind of logic that they think is valid on this section. And to some extent, that's a little absurd because that's not how we make arguments in social context. We don't necessarily have proofs for, or if we did, there wouldn't be a point to the argumentation. All right, next slide, please. So this concept of a properly drawn conclusion, I discuss this with my students as a syllogism. A syllogism is a perfect argument, valid logic, an argument with a properly drawn conclusion. And here's an example of a syllogism. Every person is mortal, that's premise 1. Socrates is a person, premise 2. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Now the conclusion here, I ask my students to underline the conclusion. So on the next slide, you'll see we have the conclusion underlined. Socrates is immortal. And I want to talk about the premises for 1 second before we move on. The first premise here is the major premise of the argument. That's the rule. Every person is immortal. That's like A goes before B. Socrates is a person is then a trigger. It's a minor premise. It's a fact that triggers the major premise or the rule. And once we trigger that rule, then we can draw the conclusion about that specific trigger. This argument is so simple, I think that's why it's interesting to study, because everyone can see why the argument works, but now we can think about it on sort of another level, a visual level. So notice that each of these statements is connecting 2 concepts, the same way that the rules were connecting 2 concepts. A is before B, B is before C, A is before C. These were all 2 concept statements. Next slide. So I've drawn that, I've illustrated that here with these lines. The concept of person is connected to the concept of mortal in the major premise. That's the purpose of the premise, to connect those concepts in a particular way. Premise 2 is connecting the concept of Socrates to the concept of person. And then the conclusion is claiming that there's a connection between the concept of Socrates and the concept of mortal. Now, also notice that like our previous example where we had the logic games deduction, we not only have connections within the rules, but connections between the rules. So the first premise and the second premise link up with this overlap in the concept of person. The second premise and the conclusion overlap because they share the concept of Socrates. And then the first premise and the conclusion share the concept of mortal. Right, so one of the things that started to occur to me when I was teaching LR for many years is that you could explain sort of the complex elements of a question to a student and they still wouldn't necessarily get it. And after many years, it occurred to me that really what's missing is this kind of basic formula, that what is it we're even supposed to be comparing these arguments to? What would a good argument look like? So on the next slide, you'll see that I've completed all of the connections. Person connected to mortal, connected to mortal, connected to Socrates to person, back up to person. And when I start thinking about this model on a visual level, it occurred to me that it looked very much like a circuit, right? It makes a complete loop around. And to make the analogy more visual, I thought, well, okay, let's think about how this might be an electrical circuit. If the conclusion of the argument is the main point, what's the main point of an electrical circuit? It's the device or the light bulb. So let's slap a light bulb on here and say, all right, this part of the circuit is really doing the work. That's the main part. But what is driving that device? It's the premises. They're supporting that conclusion. And so we can think of the premises as the batteries of the circuit. And if we have the right batteries connected the right way and they make a complete circuit, then we turn on the light. That is a valid argument. And so the relationship of the ideas is that they all must connect around to form this loop or circuit. Okay, next slide. Now, I want to put it into a little more, an easier framework that you can use. So we've got a few examples here. I'm going to continue with the Socrates example, and then Jake's going to take over and show you guys how you could use this for a few actual LSAT questions to think about them on a deeper level, not necessarily on a timed test, but thinking about them after the fact, particularly if the logic or the correct answer sort of eludes you. So the way that I diagram arguments, we'll start with the simple one, but even on complex arguments, is I start with the conclusion of the argument and I try to determine what are those two concepts that the conclusion is trying to link together. And in this case, we decided that the conclusion was linking together Socrates with the concept of mortal. And so I've got my two concepts linked together with the device, the light bulb. Okay, next, let's think about the first premise of the argument. Socrates is a person, right? How does that premise link to the argument? Well, it shares the concept of Socrates with the conclusion, so we can overlap or superimpose that part of the circuit. And then this premise connects the idea of Socrates to the idea of person. And so we have the battery driven in this direction. The next premise is that every person is mortal. And so that one connects the concept of person to the concept of mortal. Now that we've worked out the conclusion and the two premises, you can see that we've made a complete loop. And that means that the circuit is valid, or the logic is valid, and we can go ahead and turn on our light bulb. Now, one thing that I want to point out here is that in order to have a complete circuit, you not only have to have the loop, but you also have to have the batteries oriented the right way. And so this visual diagram that we've come up with, it also accounts for the conditionality of the statements. So you think about that first premise. Every person is a mortal. What if we reverse that premise? Every mortal is a person, right? If you're a mortal, then you're a person. We flip the logic around. It's still connecting the concept of mortal to person, and we still have Socrates and person connected. But now, because the batteries are pointed in opposite directions, we can't connect them according to the rules of my diagramming strategy. We have to have the batteries oriented the same way. So because we can't connect this circuit together, it's not a complete circuit, and that would be an example of flawed logic. In fact, this would be a necessary sufficient flaw. Okay, next slide, please. Let's think about another kind of flaw. Suppose we change that first premise now to every animal is immortal. We still have Socrates connected to person. The conclusion is still Socrates connected to mortal. But now, when I connect over to the mortal side, it's animal connected instead of person. Go ahead, Jake.
Oh, yeah.
All right, so this is more typical of the arguments that you'll see. We're starting to add some nuance to the model and make it more and more complicated. One of the features that you'll find on many LSAT arguments is that there's a language shift or a concept shift, right? They start using some terminology, and then at some point introduce different terminology that may or may not be equivalent. In this case, we've got the concept of person and we have the concept of animal, and they're not identical concepts. So we can't simply superimpose those blocks the way we have been in previous examples. What we have to think about here is whether there's a fair assumption involved in the shift from person to animal. And the way that we've represented assumptions in our model is with these red dotted lines and with switches. Anything that's red in the model, you'll know is representing our thoughts on where are the gaps in this logic? And more importantly, how do we fill those gaps? Because that's how we'll go about answering the question. So in this case, the important question that we have to ask ourselves is, next slide, is it reasonable to assume that every person is an animal? Right? And you'll have to think about, what framework you want for analyzing that. But as a biologist, I would say, yes, that's a reasonable assumption. And so if we flip the switch on and say, we're going to go ahead and make that assumption, or that's a reasonable assumption to make, then we still have a valid circuit, even though person and animal aren't identical concepts. Okay, next slide. Oh, this is you, Jay.
Oh, well, this is me. All right. Hi, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jake. And thank you, Keith, for that fantastic introduction to the concept, which I think is an amazingly powerful way to sum up what it is that we're looking at on LR. And before I sort of get into the details here, I want to echo what Keith has said here about LR as it relates to games. What's so interesting about LR is that now that it's become a a sort of body of information here, that you know, there's all this text, we stop thinking of it systematically. Instead, we think that there's nuance. We think that there's analysis. We think that there's something subjective about it. And for anybody who's spoken to me over the last couple of weeks, I've been talking a lot about subjectivity in reading. It's the same thing here, and Keith is exactly right, that what this boils down to is a system of rules and a system of conditionals that function just like games. It's just a little harder to penetrate because there's rhetoric around it, because there's language around it. But functionally, it's exactly the same. We just have to systematize it that way and believe that the system will work and engage in it authentically and honestly, and we're going to get there. So Keith did a great job of talking about it conceptually, and I'm sure the question now is, okay, fine, how do I do it, right? And so how you do it is this. We start by finding the conclusion, which if you aren't finding the conclusion in every argument type LR question that you see, you should start doing that, because the conclusion is the keystone. Without knowing where the conclusion is, we have no idea where the argument is going. So we identify the conclusion. And as Keith was doing, we separate the conclusion into two parts. I've been calling those two parts the subject and the full conclusion. It's subject predicate if we want to stick to that language, right? So in the case of Socrates being mortal, Socrates is the subject of the sentence. He's the subject of that conclusion. He's the person who is or does something. And the rest of it is the rest of that conclusion. So we separate the two. We have Socrates on one side. It's weird to see my hand disappearing as I disappear into my virtual background. I'm going to turn it off. We put Socrates on one side, and we put is mortal on the other. Okay. Once we've done that, we have to gather all of our premises together. And this is very much like, if we think back to our days in algebra class, right? When we get a word problem, the whole issue with word problems is that you have to turn them into math problems, right? And we're doing the same thing here. We're taking a word problem, an LR question, and we're turning it into a math problem, a logic games question. So we have to gather all of our information in our word problem, get it all in front of us and organize it for ourselves. And once we've gathered all those premises, we start to connect, right? We find a premise that connects to that subject of our conclusion, and we stick it there at the beginning of our circuit. And then one by one, we go around the circuit and we connect things. If we end up with a dead end, which for the most part, arguments on the LSAT are not valid arguments, you're going to have a dead end somewhere, either headed toward the conclusion or coming back from the conclusion. We know we found our flaw. That is our flaw. And, Keith called it this sort of rhetorical gap. I've often called it a false equivalency. That language difference is often the flaw, but it's not the only kind of flaw. Sometimes the flaw has to do with a causation framework. Sometimes the flaw has to do with a method of reasoning, but often it has to do with this false equivalency that you've got between terms, between premises, that we have to close with some form of assumption. But that's how we build the circuit. We start with a conclusion, with a subject, and we go around the chain until we hit the dead end, and we say, okay, how do I connect my dead end back to the predicate of my conclusion? So once we've sort of dealt with the process of doing it, let's try it. Okay. So those of you who have the June 2007 test, grab it. I've stuck the question here on the screen for people to read. Go ahead and take a minute to read it, and then I'm going to talk about how I built this circuit and how it works for this particular question. Okay, if everybody is happy at this point, job one is to identify the conclusion, right? For those who've worked with me, you hear me talk about conclusions being this sort of the same as writing a thesis on a seventh grade paper, right? It's your statement of opinion. It's your analysis of the world. And so in this case, the thing that is not a fact here is drawn out by the word should. And so our conclusion here is that first sentence, double-blind techniques should be used whenever possible in scientific experiments. So I take that sentence and I stick it up here in two green boxes, right? The double-blind, here, I'll get a little pointer. The double-blind techniques here on the left, and then the full conclusion here on the right. And I say to myself, okay, how can I connect double-blind techniques to the fact that they should be used whenever possible? Well, the question itself said that double-blind techniques help prevent misinterpretations. So here's our overlap, double-blind and double-blind. And this idea extends to helping prevent misinterpretations. Another thing that was stated by the question as a premise was that scientists should avoid misinterpretations. So now we've connected misinterpretations to scientists. And therefore, we have now scientists connected validly to double-blind techniques, using the word should, and we have a closed circuit. And our argument is valid, which is a bit of a rarity on the LSAT, but here it is. And it just so happens that this question is a can you find the conclusion question. And so in that way, we can have a valid question, a valid argument, because there is no flaw, there is no assumption. We're not trying to strengthen the argument. There's nothing wrong with it. So that is a situation in which you can have a valid argument. So here you have it. This is sort of the simplest version of this. We have a conclusion that's very clearly connecting two concepts, and we bridge that gap by going around the circuit only twice with two premises, and we get back to where we started. If we want to get a little more complex, we're going to move on to question 5 in section 2. So everyone give a quick read of this one. And while you're doing it, see if you can grab the conclusion out of here. Make sure that you identify it. And so you can see at the bottom here that this is evidence against. This is a weaken question. So we go on to the question and we say, what was the conclusion drawn by that argument? Well, the conclusion was that the gas buildup in the atmosphere caused the temperature increase. So here we are with a conclusion that talks about causality. So very quickly, I'm going to do like the 15-second version of causality. Anybody that's read any of the written materials out there knows that one of the things that the LSAT likes to talk about is causation does not equal correlation. That when two things correlate, when they happen at the same time, that doesn't necessarily mean that one caused the other. The classic example from your college statistics course is there's this correlation between ice cream sales and car accidents on the highway. And it turns out that there's, a third factor that causes them both. But those two things happening together doesn't mean that when you buy ice cream, you're more likely to crash your car. That's only one part of demonstrating causation, though. There are other parts to demonstrating causation. There are lots of ways to talk about it. People talk about it lots of ways. A way that Keith and I have sort of come together on this idea is a 3-part causation framework. Correlation is one of them. The other one is something we call timing, right? Does the thing that caused happen before the result, right? If you have cause and effect, the cause has to happen first, the effect has to happen after, and they have to happen right next to each other. One can't happen way before the other or after the other. It needs to line up well. And the third one we call mechanism. Is there a means by which it makes sense that the first one would cause the second one? Is that explainable scientifically or through some other means, right? So while you're going through a causation question, you need to notice, hey, they're claiming causation. I need to make sure all those 3 things are in place. So here we have our number 5. We've got our subject of the conclusion here, and we've got the whole conclusion over here. How can we connect these things? Well, the first thing we know is that minor gas built up in the atmosphere blocks Earth's outward heat flow. that was given by the argument. That was a premise. Fine, so I can make that connection. Can I connect blocking outward heat flow to causing the temperature increase? Well, this is the mechanism of causation, right? This is the way it could have caused it. But did they line up timing wise? And is there correlation? Did they happen at the same time? And did it happen enough and frequently enough for it to make sense? Right? Here we have our correlation. There was a 0.5 degree temperature increase over the last century. That's our correlation. They happened. And there's a way for them to happen. But did the timing line up? We don't know. They didn't give us anything else. And so because of that, we would have to assume that the gases built up before the temperature increased. That would demonstrate the timing and bring us to our conclusion. But right now the switch is off because we have no information. Now, this question in particular is a weakened question. What they're trying to get you to do is notice that the timing is missing. And so in order to weaken the question, we can say, I can flip-flop the timing. What if I get the gases building up after the temperature increases, or the gases building up centuries before the temperature increases? If I can do that, well, then I have no causation, because I know I have correlation, I know I have mechanism, but I don't have timing. Turns out, oh, sorry, went one too far. It turns out that that was the right answer, right? That the right answer said that the warming happened before 1940 and the gases built up afterwards. They flip-flopped the timing that would have made this make sense. So in that way, they prevented causation from happening because we've got our mechanism, we've got our correlation, but our timing didn't work. One of the ways that I've been understanding this recently, and by the way, you'll notice that Keith and I will talk a lot about sort of new revelations about LR as we've been building this. And I think that's important to call out, right? He and I have both been doing this for 20 years. And we've done every LSAT there is multiple times, tens of times, hundreds of times. And every time we go through a question, we learn something new. And every time he and I debate one of these questions, we learn something new from each other. There's always something new to learn about ways to look at these things. And, you know, those of you who were with us last week talking about triple review, imagine instead of triple review, you get 50 times review. And that's kind of where we're at with this 2007 test. Every time we look at these questions, we find a new way of thinking about it. So one of these new things that I've discovered is that you can think of the mechanisms of causation as necessary assumptions. You need them in order to get to the answer. No one of them alone is sufficient. They don't ensure that you get to the conclusion, but they're necessary. They have to be there. And so you can think of them like switches along the way. I've got my mechanism switch through a premise, so I don't even need the switch because it's a premise. I've got my correlation as sort of stated in the conclusion because that premise is there, but I have no timing premise, and I can think of it like a switch I need to turn on. If I want to strengthen it, I've got to turn on that switch. If I want to weaken it, I have to make sure that that switch is off. So something to think about in that way. Okay. Next one, if you guys want to read ahead, it's question 21 in that same section 2. So again, we've got vulnerable to criticism. So we're going to weaken this argument. We can identify the conclusion quickly because this driver, who is clearly reckless, says trading my sports car in for a minivan would lower my risk. Would, right? So in the parlance of linguistics, would is a conditional statement. But in our framework here, this is a statement of opinion, right? This is what he believes will happen. And again, we've got causation, right? He's believing that doing the one thing, trading in the sports car, will cause a lower risk of having an accident. So before I get into this, I want to point out that this was one of the ones that Keith and I debated the most hotly, and we had the most fun with, and we learned the most about. It was really interesting, and we came up with a lot of ways to think about it. There is no one answer here, but we got to a place that I thought was pretty elegant. I don't know why that is still showing up, so I'm going to click all the way through this. So here we have our conclusion. His accident risk will decrease if he trades in for a minivan. We had a premise, which was that his accident risk, his friends attribute his accident risk, here's the overlap, accident risk, to reckless driving, right? There's your overlap, and this was a premise in the argument, so that can be connected with a battery. But we have a problem, which is that timing and mechanism are unclear here. We have correlation, right? We know that when you that it could decrease if he trades it in, but we don't know why that would happen or whether or not the causal relationship lines up the right way. So in order to demonstrate that this was a valid conclusion, he would have to tell us, like, there are statistics that show that people who drive sports cars and then drive minivans, those particular people have a reduced risk of accidents. Instead, he's just talking about statistics broadly, and broad statistics can't apply to one person. If he's a reckless driver, just having a minivan doesn't mean that he's going to drive it any less recklessly. So in that way, we've got a causal relationship that is not fantastic. Now, this is the classic example. Correlation does not represent causation, right? And that's the answer in the question itself, that just because there's correlation, all the rest of it isn't there, right? But calling out for yourselves, what is that rest of it? What is that assumption that I need? Well, I need timing, I need the direction of causality, and I need a mechanism. I need a way for trading in a sports car for a minivan to be the thing that decreases your risk. And there are no facts and evidence. We can come up with reasons for that in our own head, but bringing in facts from outside, bringing in our own knowledge should not be necessary here. There should be enough in the question to get us there, and there clearly isn't. They don't give us enough. So that's that question. And you can see all of these sort of start from the same place. We show our conclusion up here. We connect it with this light bulb. We want that light bulb to go on. We slap our premises down. We figure out that first one that overlaps with that subject of the conclusion. But then where do we go from there? Well, we're stuck. We have no more information. So we need to bridge the gap with some form of assumption. And in this case, there's nothing more to assume. So there it is, right? Reckless driving would have to be countered by purchasing a statistically safer car, and that's not clear here. So this next question, question 23, is one Keith particularly loves. So I'm going to pass it over to him to explain this one.
Take a moment to read this, and then I'll talk to you guys about the practicality of all of this and how to use it. Okay, this one's kind of tricky, and it's a sufficient assumption question, so we know there's some flawed logic here, and it's really technical, involves a whole bunch of conditional statements. I think this was really kind of the question that this whole thing was modeled for, really, because some of the simpler ones where there's just a cause correlation error, I usually just see it, and I don't really need to draw a model to pick the right answer. But on a really technical argument, sometimes I don't even understand what they're trying to tell me, frankly. Some of the ones about morality are very complicated. The philosophy ones usually are. So I had to kind of develop a system. How am I going to work through this systematically when the connections aren't perfectly clear to me? And this strategy that we've been showing you guys, we've been showing you very stylized images with light bulbs and this and that. But at the end of the day, what this is a description of the mental process that I actually use to solve LR questions. And that's why I think it's valuable to learn it and for me to teach it to you. So the way that I would attack this question is I would start with the conclusion, just like Jake has been doing. That's the last sentence. And then what I do is I go on this treasure hunt where I take the concepts in the conclusion and I start looking for them in the premises. I have students ask me all the time, how do I find flaws? It's sort of an odd question because if you're good at finding flaws, you don't have to ask how to find them. You just read it and you kind of see where the gap is. But that wasn't occurring for my students. And so I came up with this sort of steps that they could take to find it. And step one is you start with the concepts in the conclusion and you start matching them up to the concepts in the premises. Everything should match up to its closest like analog, basically. Whatever's the most similar concept, you try to get those ideas kind of organized together to see if that you can create this string that connects the two ideas from the conclusion independently. You're sort of trying to make an independent proof of that connection by drawing another way around to it. And that's the mental process that I use. I'm just putting it in visual form. So how do you go about using this in a practical way? I think it's best used for blind review when you're doing untimed practice. I don't think it's highly practical to draw out a bunch of diagrams on a timed test. But when you're trying to figure out an argument that you just don't get, that's when you can start to draw some little circles and say, let's think about this conceptually and how they overlap. The other thing that I found, and Jake has talked about this, is that if you're willing to go through this process on an argument, it gives you a firmer basis for discussion, because there are several arguments in this section that Jake and I just fundamentally approach a different way. And I think that if we had only discussed them on a verbal level, we just would have had to agree to disagree and say, you do it your way, I do it mine. I'm never going to be able to learn that other way. But because we put it into a visual format and showed each other the diagrams and changed them and said, I think this should go here. I think this connection looks better like this. Makes more sense if we lay it out that way. It gave us a much more robust basis for conversation. And so it occurs to me that if a student comes to me with a map of the logic, I'll be able to identify sort of immediately where I think that map is confused. But if they just come to me and say, I didn't understand answer choice D, then I'm sort of doing this high level work without checking whether they really understood the sort of fundamentals of the argument to begin with. Okay,
Well,
so let's, yeah, go ahead, Jake.
Yeah, before you go on, I just want to say, like, this question in particular was one of those that was particularly not contentious, but that we dove in pretty hard on this question. And it was interesting because I came at this question purely from a conditional standpoint. And Keith came at it from more of the circuit standpoint. And what we ended up discovering is that we were thinking about it the same way. It's just that the pathway was different. But the other thing that I think you just said that I think is fantastic is that you as students, when you come to a tutor, when you go to an expert and you say, I'm struggling here, having drawn out your thinking on the page and made an accounting of it is very similar to what your math teachers would have told you in middle school. If you don't show me your work, I can't see what you're thinking. Because if you could verbalize what you were thinking, you would probably have gotten to the right answer. But if you can show me your work, show me what you did to get there, then I can help you to connect the dots where you couldn't, right? And so in this way, we're trying to give you a vocabulary to write down your thinking, right? This is a means by which you can map out your thinking. And like Keith said, on blind review, and even more in that third review, when you've really got all the time in the world to say, like, what was I really trying to do here timed? And when I had all the time in the world, what did I try to attempt to get to this answer? If you have it on the page, then you have a record of it that you can carry forward. You can go back 2 weeks later and try the question again. What was the pathway? What was the right approach? Hey, Keith, hey, Jake, I don't know what to do here. And then we can look at it and we say, no, you didn't match up the right thing. You put that in the wrong place. So that's something to keep in mind, that you really want to develop that written vocabulary. Anyway,
You know, I also think it can feed back. I'll tell you guys one more quick anecdote before I move on and diagram this one, that when I was learning to symbolize conditional statements, I had sort of a similar pattern that we're describing here, which is that I could read them and sort of intuitively understand most of them. And as a teacher, I was having to diagram for my students statements that I didn't personally need to diagram to understand. But what ended up occurring is that my conditional diagramming skills became so robust that I learned to be able to diagram far more complicated statements, number one. But then number two, I also learned to start thinking about the diagrams without drawing them. And so I could kind of picture relationships that I really had to rely on intuition before. And so what I'm thinking is that if you guys are willing to sort of, you know, show your work, like Jake says, you'll actually reach a point where it's easier to do that work in your head.
Yeah.
The connections, it'll be easier for you to make them and hold them and understand what you're trying to do at the end of the day if you'll commit to drawing a few of these out. And I really like what Jake said about the third review, because I'm sensitive to my students' time and the efficiency, and I know that the methods I teach are long and drawn out, and I don't want to take a long time just for the sake of taking a long time. And so doing this on the strategy review, I think, is really brilliant for the ones where you're just, even after a tremendous amount of, you know, after 2 reviews through and reading explanations, you're still just like, huh? I think that's the point where if you want to understand that question, now you've exhausted the sort of verbal possibilities. You must try something different. And this gives you an option for something to try. Okay, let's map out this argument. Let's look at the next slide. Our conclusion is the last sentence, that if an action leaves the aggregate well-being unchanged, then that action is morally right. Okay, so now I know what my framework is. I have to go back and see, well, do I know anything about actions that leave aggregate well-being unchanged? Do I know anything about actions that are morally right? The next premise of the argument says that, next slide, please, if an action increases aggregate well-being, that would make it morally right. And so we can connect that premise up in this particular way. But what's interesting about this premise, and this was one of the things that Jake was kind of scratching his head about when I first showed him the diagram, was that this premise cannot link. It cannot be used to complete the circuit, because part of the conclusion is that we're talking about actions that leave aggregate well-being unchanged. And so if they leave it unchanged, they cannot increase it, and therefore this is a premise that simply can't be invoked. It would get us to the conclusion if we could, but they've stipulated up front that that's not a viable way to get there. So we have to sort of push forward. Do we have some other way to get there? Well, there's premise number 2, which is a biconditional statement. It says that if an action is morally wrong, then, you know, if and only if it reduces the aggregate well-being. So now we have to kind of scratch our heads, because the thing that we have to match up is morally right, and what we have in this premise is morally wrong. And the other half of our conclusion is leaving aggregate well-being unchanged, and this is about reducing aggregate well-being. So all of these sort of, again, contradictory to the points that we're supposed to be overlapping with. Now I know I've exhausted my premises. I have to start trying something else. What I need to start trying are the contrapositives of these conditional statements. So let's focus on that one at the bottom left. The contrapositive, if we flip it and negate both terms, is that an action that does not reduce aggregate well-being is not morally wrong. Okay, these still don't overlap perfectly, because the concept up on the left side of the conclusion is that we're looking for an action that leaves aggregate well-being unchanged. And this says does not reduce. Those are not the exact same concepts. But remember in my first example when I said, well, all people are animals, so we're just going to go ahead and connect those. Same thing here. If an action leaves the aggregate well-being unchanged, then it doesn't reduce the aggregate well-being, right? It just stays the same. It doesn't reduce. But notice that this arrow has to go a particular way. It happens to be the correct way here, but I want to make a point before we go on to the final connection, was that I wouldn't be able to connect that arrow the other way. Because if an action does not reduce, there's two choices then. It either stays the same or it increases. And so I can't say that if something doesn't reduce, then it automatically leaves it unchanged. That wouldn't work in the reverse direction. It only works in this direction, the same way all people are animals was a fair assumption, but going the opposite way would have been unfair. I mention that because we're asked to do something similar on the right side of the equation. In order for me to get to, I'm sorry, let me start that over. We're asked to do something similar, and that is that I could connect these the wrong way rather easily. I could say, look, if something is morally right, then obviously it's not morally wrong. And therefore I could go ahead and stick a battery in there, but it would be sort of facing the wrong way. So what we have to do is say, okay, well, what's the problem here? I can't go the other direction because an action could be not morally wrong, but still not morally right. We can think about this middle space, neutral actions that have no moral consequences whatsoever. If I go to bed at 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock, there's no sort of morality to the decision. So you can't automatically say that because it's not wrong, it must be right. And now we've identified the gap in the argument because we're completely out of premises. The premise on the right is completely excluded. That's actually contradictory to the, to the conclusion. So in order to fix this and make it a complete circuit, we're going to have to connect or grapple with this false equivalence, is what Jake calls it. I like to call it a concept shift. So if you go to the next slide, I've highlighted the concept shift or the false equivalence here, and that is that not morally wrong doesn't mean the same thing as morally right. And in order to complete the circuit, we would have to assume that it does, and therefore we can represent the assumption like this. It's a switch that's off, and the assumption of the argument would have to be that any action that is not morally wrong is morally right. Notice how this assumption states, sort of connects the two points of the false equivalence. When you find that concept shift, the flaw of the argument, when that's the premise of it, and it's not based on causation or some kind of deeper principle, when it's truly just they went from this concept to that one, the correct answer has to do the exact same thing. It has to explicitly connect the two things that were implicitly linked in the original argument. So the correct answer here, the sufficient assumption that would flip the switch on, is what I've stated in the box, that any action that is not morally right, not morally wrong, is morally right. And if we flip that switch on and assume that to be true, now we have a complete circuit, and that's why that's a sufficient assumption of the argument. Okay, you want to take it back over, Jake?
Absolutely. So first of all, that it's a fantastic explanation of what's going on, and this is a great example of sort of an assumption that's both necessary and sufficient. Right? We can't complete it any other way. And I love the explanation here. And it leads very well into the next one, which is question 6. This is another one of these that feels like a set of conditionals. And in that way, it feels like a thing that you should draw out a whole bunch of conditional statements for. But if we think of it in this circuit framework, it's actually very elegant to just go premise by premise and see what does and does not connect. So take a quick read. So again, we've got a sufficient assumption question, right? Follows logically if. And we have to identify that conclusion. And the conclusion is highlighted by the word thus, right? That's your sort of classic conclusion word. So thus, Murray, and we'll ignore the parenthetical for a second because the parenthetical is actually a premise. Thus, Murray cannot be accepted for the position of executive administrator since he has a felony conviction. Okay, fine. So we're going to start with laying out our conclusion. Here we are. Here's Murray. Murray is unacceptable for executive administrator. Shoot. and our light bulb's off. So what do? We start with our premises and we say, okay, let's connect Murray to stuff. What's the first thing we can connect Murray to? What do we know about Murray? He's an accountant. Okay, fine. That's good that he's an accountant. Do we need him to be an accountant? Do we care that he's an accountant? No. That's a dead end for us because there's no way to connect accountant to being acceptable or unacceptable for executive administrator. And we're trying to make him unacceptable, and there's no connection there. We have no other evidence. So we go on to our second connection to Murray, which is that Murray has a bachelor's degree. And what do we know about bachelor's degrees? Well, we know that no undergraduate degree means that he cannot be appointed to the executive board. But this premise says he does have a bachelor's degree. So we can't connect those two. That doesn't work. So we've got a dead end here again. Little boxes that say we cannot connect. Shoot, we have to move on to another premise. Murray's got a master's degree. Do we care about master's degrees? Is there any other information about master's degrees? Graduate degrees? Nope. Nope, we have another box again. No way to connect that to acceptability for executive administrator. So we have to move on again. And the fourth piece of information we have about Murray, that fourth premise about Murray, is that he has a felony conviction. You can see I've highlighted in yellow because that was my aha, right? I had 4 premises prior to this that had no connections to each other. I had no way to link them up. But felony conviction, I can link up. Why can I link that up? Because I know that when you have a felony conviction, you cannot be appointed to the executive board. I followed farther down the path here. And so in that way, I've connected well, right? I've connected well to another piece of information. Great, I have another premise. I'm powering my circuit, but I still can't get from here to here. Because though they sound really similar, here's our false equivalence. Your LSAT writers, when they were in their little cubicles in the dark basement somewhere, decided that they would hide this equivalency or lack thereof in 2 terms that sound really similar to each other but are not. Executive board and executive administrator. And they are not the same thing. Well, we don't know anything about that. So in order to connect them, we need to assume that not being able to be on the executive board means that you're not able to be the executive administrator. We need that piece of information, and that's not there. There's no premise for that. So that's our assumption. And if we can turn that switch on, like that, we would turn our light bulb on. And it just so happens that the correct answer, just like in Keith's example, does exactly the thing that we needed it to. It took us from no executive board to no executive administrator. Only those who can be appointed to the executive administrator, to the executive board, are acceptable for executive administrator. And if we take the contrapositive of that statement, we get exactly what was in our assumption. And thus we have a closed circuit. We have an assumption that's sufficient to get us there. Keith, did you have comment?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's powerful about the method, even if you're not making the diagrams, but finding these false equivalencies, having a method to find them, is that the answers, some of them were very straightforward. In my question, it was basically the simplest articulation of the assumption, but frequently it won't be. It'll be a paraphrase or the contrapositive of the most direct route. And so being able to pinpoint precisely what you need before you move on to the answer choices, that's really why I made up this strategy. Before I made up any of the visuals, why was I bothering to do this? Why was I parsing the conclusion so carefully, finding concepts, going on that treasure hunt back to the premises? It's because I don't trust myself to remember all the details. I need to know, what is the detail? What is the like the thing, the main gap in this logic that I can focus on for a few minutes and compare the answer choices to? And I wish I could tell you that I was 100% perfect at finding that. There are questions where I think, oh, I know this flaw. And then I read all the answers and I'm like, oh, crap, that's really tough. They didn't give me what I expected. But what I tell my students is if you go into the answers with no expectations, you're essentially just guessing. In fact, it might even be worse than that. You might be playing into some psychological tricks that they can play to make those answers more attractive. I've heard of questions on the MCAT, not so much on the LSAT, where the average number of test takers that get the question correct is less than 25%. There's only four answer choices on MCAT questions. So what that means is that if every single student guessed randomly, as a group, they would have done better than actually attempting the question, right? Good question writers can create answer choices that change your interpretation of the original argument in a way that you cannot go back and unsee, unless you're a really skilled writer who knows what they're up to. But if you can thwart that by saying, I already know what I'm looking for, and no matter what kind of verbal jargon you give me, I'm going to compare it to this simple form, that's when I think you can really become good at LR. And it doesn't hurt me that I'm not 100% correct in predicting these, because I'm so good at doing it that I get 15 or 20 questions are gimmies. And then I bank a bunch of extra time to go back and rethink my circuit on the tougher questions.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And you know, those who know me, you know, as Keith does, I've taught almost everything. I don't teach the MCAT, but I've taught SSAT, SAT, ACT, GRE, GMAT, LSAT. And, you know, those who go back far enough to remember sentence completions on the SAT, when I first learned how to teach the SAT, they said the key to sentence completions, and this was true for years, 10 years I did this, the key to sentence completions is don't look at the answer choices. Because if you look at the answer choices, they are going to draw you in with a word that sounds really good for a reason that isn't the correct one, right? And so, you know, I talk about, there's this old question about an ostrich in a field, right? And ostriches are very blank animals. They can be seen at distances of up to 500 feet. And so one of the answer choices is, cumbersome. One of the answer choices is cumbersome. And if you know the word cumbersome, cumbersome means big and heavy and awkward to carry, right? But if you plugged that word into the blank, you would say, well, it means big. And so ostriches are big. They can be seen at far away. And if you're not thinking about the subtleties of the language because you're 15 or 16, then, you know, you can get that question wrong. But if you prephrase it and you do it literally, right, and you're very meticulous, like we're being here with these diagrams, you would say, no, it didn't say he was big. It said that you could see it. And all it said was that you could see it. And so if you're literal with the language. All I need here is that no executive board equals no executive administrator. And that's all I need to make this happen. I'm going to go find the one that says that and only that, and that's your intention. You're far more likely to get to the right answer. It turns out, by the way, that the ostrich was conspicuous, which means that you can see it from far away. Maybe it's bright and colorful, right, rather than being tall. So in that way, right, prephrasing and really sticking to doing analysis before you start shoving answer choices into the system to see if they work, you're going to let the test makers in their little cubicles in their basements with their demon hands trying to trick you. You're going to let them trick you with their subtle language tricks and drawing vocabulary in from the question into the answer to make you think it's right because it's using the same words. Those are the things that they're doing when they're writing this question. And we want to take that weapon out of their hands. And we do that by not looking at the answers if we can get away with it.
You know, Jake, you reminded me of a story that I tell all the time, but I tell it all the time because it occurs all the time and it's hilarious. Every time I work with a new student on LR, I mean, I can predict it. It's like clockwork. When we start to work a question, we'll sit down, we'll look at the question, we'll talk about the question type, we'll read the argument, I'm lucky if we can get them to pause and find the conclusion. I'm usually pretty insistent about that. But then at that point, they're gone. They're on answer choice B, and like my head is spinning. At this point, I'm like, wait, I haven't even figured out how this argument works. How am I going to strengthen it? How am I going to tell you the assumption when I don't understand the logic of it? I don't even know what the author intended it to mean. So I find it really funny that I'll spend 20 seconds or so just telling them, okay, just be quiet for a second, all right? I need to think this through. And once I figure out the answer, I'll tell you how to get there. And you should probably be thinking about it too and not reading the answer choices, because the answer choices are there to trick you. You know, it's sort of like unfortunate that they have to give you the right answer in that mix. They're not happy to do it. That's the only format of the test that's sort of easy to give. So if they have to give you the correct answer, then what they're going to do is make it darn hard to find in many cases by presenting a lot of very attractive traps and by obscuring that correct answer with language like this one, where you'll have to manipulate it a little bit to get it back to your pre-phrase. But if you didn't have the pre-phrase, it would be easier to read this and just say, that doesn't work. You know, like not even kind of a mental laziness, or you don't even bother to fully interpret it and plug it in. The other thing that I find interesting about this, Jake, is that when I engage in very aggressive pre-phrasing, it's common for there to be questions where none of the answers are even contenders. Like the real easy questions, I'll look at all the answers and say, I don't even have to read these very carefully because there's only one that could even possibly be correct. There's only one that mentions executive administrator and executive board.
Mm-hmm.
And so no matter what relationship they've described here, it's truly the only contender that links the ideas that have to be linked. So
Yeah,
there's a lot of questions like that. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, you know, this is sort of the crux of the false equivalency, right? If you can identify every false equivalency there is, right? If you can do, you know, I sort of call it self-Socratic method, right? Ask yourself the right questions to get yourself to the right place. What's the conclusion? Why is that the conclusion? How did they draw that conclusion? So what? Who cares, right? Why does that evidence have to get you to the conclusion? Okay, what if this? What if that? What if this? What if that? And if I can come up with 3 or 4 what ifs, right? Okay, fine. Now I can identify the 2 things that didn't match up, right? What if the executive administrator is not on the board? What if the executive board has different requirements from the executive administrator? What if there are special things going on with that person? I know the 2 things that aren't matching because I've asked myself what if about it so many times. And the first 50 of these that I do with somebody, it's look at the answer choices. It has to contain both concepts. If it doesn't, you can't answer it. You just can't, because it needs to connect those 2 concepts. And like you said, only one of them has it. While we still have, I know we're already 10 minutes over, there's one more kind of question that is really interesting in this framework and is a type of LR question that I think is extremely challenging. But when we can call it out as different from the rest of these, I think it's really important. This one, like all the other examples, the one that we're looking at now with Murray, is a binary system. It's Murray either is or is not acceptable for an executive administrator. There's no spectrum there, right? There's nothing quantitative about it, nothing measurable about it. But in this next one, which is question 9 from this section, take a read quickly, and then I want to talk about what it says in the conclusion, which is different from all the other questions we've looked at so far. So again, we've got a weekend question. You notice a theme here. The weekend questions. This is a very powerful system. But the thing that's really interesting about this conclusion, the number of people in this age group is we can expect a reversal of the trend, right? Here's your conclusion. We can expect a reversal of the trend. That's not a thing that is yes or no. That is not a thing that he either is or is not the executive administrator. In this case, we've got something measurable, something quantitative that we're going to turn it around. The graph is going to go the other direction, right? But that means that there's sort of a mixture here, a blend, a knob or a dial that we're turning to say, well, you know, maybe the trend will dip precipitously. Maybe it will go up. Maybe it will stay flat. Maybe it'll be anywhere in that degree. And there are lots of inputs that can affect it. And so in that way, what we've got is a very different system here. We still have our conclusion with a subject and a predicate here, right? So we have video games, overall sales declining, right? And the premise is that video games historically are bought by 13 to 16-year-olds, 3/4 of them. And The other premise is that those people are going to decline. And so given that, there is a mechanism and correlation for causation here, right? That there's a way for overall sales of video games to decline because the people that buy them, there are going to be fewer of them around. So presumably there are going to be fewer video games sold. But that is a possible point of weakness, right? We could think about that as a weakness. But we would have to assume that just because the age group numbers will decline, that the age group sales would decline, right? We would have to assume that, though it's a pretty reasonable assumption, right? You know, people are animals, that sort of thing. But we do have sort of this dial, this balance of effect on overall sales, right? Like clearly we have an input into that mixture, right? We can call it sort of a fade knob, right? Like your front and back stereo buttons on your car stereo, right? It doesn't have to be all the way to the front or all the way to the back. It can be somewhere in the middle. But this is causing it to turn one way, right? It's saying, no, 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 look, age group sales are going to decline. That's going to mean overall sales are declining. But that means no other inputs into the system, that nothing else can happen. But something else can happen. What about all the other age groups? We would have to presume that the mixture, right, that historically 3/4 were bought by 13 to 16-year-olds, we would have to presume that that stayed steady. And that's not necessarily an assumption we can make. What if that changes? What if instead we turn this switch on and other age groups will no longer purchase less than 1/4 of the video games? What if the video game market turns toward 30-year-olds, which clearly it has because they have more money, and they start buying way more video games comparatively than the 13 to 16-year-olds did? Well, suddenly our mixture changes. And now this is a powerful input into our system, and maybe sales will not decline anymore. Maybe they'll stay steady, maybe they'll go up. We don't really know, but we have something quantitative that we don't have any data on. And so I think the thing that I wanted to call out here is that if you can tell that what you've got here is a system not of yes or no, on or off, a binary system, but instead one where there are lots of inputs into the thing that you're measuring, and they're only considering one of them, then you can have, for those of you that remember your high school physics course, you can have a parallel circuit, right? You can have two different circuits running in parallel that each can sort of input a bit of the a bit into the mixture here. And you can say, well, maybe they'll decline, maybe they won't decline, maybe there will be a little of both. It's unclear. We don't know because there are a lot of things that have not been stated. And so this is a way to weaken the argument, to say, I'm going to feed another input into my mixture. And so I'm going to turn my dial a little bit, not to be all the way to the front speakers, maybe not all the way to the back speakers, but somewhere in between. And that's a way to weaken this kind of argument.
You know what's fascinating about this, Jake, how powerful these are. So while you're describing that, I've seen this before, I helped you make it. While you're describing that, you know what I was thinking about? That one about the dogs being moderate barkers, frequent barkers. Yeah. That one could have other inputs. You can train a dog to bark more than its breed typically does. So, I mean, even that one, we could build this kind of thing into it and say, look, there's other ways to tweak that argument.
You know, what's funny is that I made a note on that slide yesterday to say, make this one more like 9.
Ah, cool. Okay, well, so we're on the same page.
Yeah. So that is the last slide in this slideshow. And just to point out, by the way, that the correct answer to weaken the argument was that most purchases over the past 3 years were from people older than 16, which reinforces the idea that we were talking about.
You know, some of these are post hoc, so that's why I keep reinforcing that. Like, I don't want you guys to think that we just made a bunch of models of correct answers. It truly is the way I do it. I wouldn't have asked Jake to help me make this if I didn't have some like verification that it was a valid way to think about the section and how to approach it. All I did was take the mental process that I use and draw a picture of it. And then the picture turned out to be kind of fun to talk about. And Jake and I've had a blast making these. And it really has changed how I think about them. I used to think about arguments as very contrived, as having a flaw, as being, and now I think about them in a much more holistic way, that every point of connection is a potential point of flaw. unless it's been explicit, Socrates to Socrates, person to person.
Right.
But any change in the language is going to cause me to pause and say, how reasonable is it to jump from that set of words to the other? And sometimes it's fair, sometimes it's a perfect paraphrase, other times it's not, but the ideas are related in a common sense way. And then you've got a majority of the arguments where they've simply been unfaithful in the paraphrase, and it's an actual flaw of the argument.
Yeah, there was an interesting conversation in the Facebook group a couple weeks ago. Somebody was really upset about some particular assumption in an LR question and said, you're not supposed to have to bring in outside information into an LR. And I said, well, look, there's a difference between bringing in information in terms of the definition of a word as opposed to bringing in information that would really be an assumption, right? The definition of the word person is an organism in the animal kingdom, and therefore that's not an unreasonable assumption for the LSAT to expect you to make, right? But in a particular context, executive board and executive administrator, we don't know anything about this city or that board or anything, and so we're not supposed to make that kind of assumption.
Yeah,
But
those terms don't have the same kind of definitions, right?
Right. This is about the definition of the word. That's different, right? But this isn't that.
I did find one this week, Jake, where they had said something like, what was it, like patient people, and then they explained what they do. And then later on, they had switched to doing the thing patiently. And I remember pausing and saying, wait, do we know necessarily that patient people do this particular thing patiently? And ultimately, I concluded that the semantics of the sentence certainly implied that the description as patient applied to the particular activity that the sentence was about. And I concluded that although there was a language shift there, that it just would sort of defy common sense to say, no, these patient people don't do this one thing we're talking about patiently, but we still mention they're patient anyway. So that was an instance where I had paused using the method we're describing. I recognized that the language was different, and then analyzed my way out of it and said, that can't be the right answer. That would be so ridiculous.
But all the more reason then to think that this is the right perspective, the right lens to look at this through, right? Because if we don't stop at that moment, maybe that one isn't a problem, but there are the other ones where they'll use two different definitions for the same word in the same LR in order to throw you off the trail to assume that they're the same, when in fact they're using the word completely differently. To mean different things.
I don't think I've come across one like that recently to really think that through. Interesting.
I just saw one. I'll have to go back and find it. It was somewhere in the 50s, I think. But what's so interesting about this is that this also reinforces this thing I was saying the other day about not just focusing on the wrong answers, but the right answers, right? That when you're doing a strategy review, yes, there are times when you should just be focusing on the things that need growth, but especially when there are sort of, you're sort of at the end of your psychological wits and you need some successes and you need some bolstering, to think about the things that you've really done well is really powerful. And in this way, like, this is not a framework to do the test time, certainly. It's a framework for you to analyze and learn and understand deductive reasoning in a more robust way and in a more powerful way. But taking note, pausing and saying, that was a thing I drew from this idea of circuits and was able to come across this language gap and was able to navigate it well. That moment of saying, hey, that's a thing that I drew from that understanding. That's from my toolkit. That's from my quiver, right? I pulled out this other framework of understanding and used it well. That reinforces that the way you're thinking about it in strategy review is good, and that we're learning. And that's the whole reason we do this, right? We come up with new ways to think about it for exactly that reason.
Why don't we give a quick rundown of what they can purchase, and then we'll open it up to questions.
So for those of you who weren't here at the beginning, Keith and I were talking about next Wednesday that we would do a reading comp webinar, which I think is great. And so Keith and I will have to circle up tomorrow or Friday to talk about what that'll be.
Whoops.
But we'll figure that out. So hopefully you guys will be interested in that. That'll be next Wednesday night. And then starting on September 26th, we have a series of 12 group tutoring sessions Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays at 8 p.m. Eastern. And that'll run from September 26th to October 23rd, I think is the last Friday in that
Right.
series. And what we're going to do is get everybody on the same schedule with the same practice tests, the same sections. Everybody's going to be doing timed and blind review on their own. If they can, some strategy review as well. And then we'll come together as a group with everybody's answers. We'll do some analysis of what sort of what common issues were in the sections, if we can come up with them, and some things that we think are interesting. Certainly with games, we'll diagram everything for you. You can see some comparative diagrams, things that are different between the way Keith and I do them, though they're complementary and we all get to the same place. But it's a really great opportunity to work with both of us. And that's only $300 for all 12 hours. Which I think is fantastic. Spots are filling up quick, so if it's something that you want to do, please reach out to us. And in addition, anybody that's in that class, we're giving the webinars for free, and we'll also extend an offer to do 3 hours of one-on-one with either of us for an extra $300, which is a pretty steep discount on our hourly rates as well. So that's coming up. We're also, Keith and I both are offering small group tutoring. If you want to get together a small group of a couple of people to defray the cost of one-on-one time, we're definitely open to that. So reach out to us whether you do or do not have that group. If you do, great. And if you don't, we'll reach out to the Facebook group and the Reddit group and see if we can grab other people to sort of fill up those spots. Is there anything else?
I'm really excited about the class. I taught classroom LSAT for a long time for a major company. And one of the reasons I left is that I just started to believe that model was broken, having one teacher and so many students. And I wanted to try different things that they didn't want me to try. And so I went off and said, I'm going to go do my own thing. And I've been tutoring for, a decade since I left that. I didn't think I'd ever go back to classroom LSAT teaching because I've railed against it. I've said, look, it leaves people behind. Other people are way ahead and they're learning stuff they already know. This isn't a great model. But I think we've addressed those issues in two ways. And one is that because we're both going to teach every class, we'll have two sets of eyes on what everyone's doing. And so if the instructor has to take a certain pace, the secondary instructor can slow down, take a group aside, or get in the chat to handle issues that ordinarily a teacher would either have to stop or just not address. And the other thing is, we're not going to do a lot of lecturing. And that's why I think this will work, is that what we want you guys to do is get on this schedule where we do prep tests 73, 74, 75. We tell you which section and when, and you've done a lot of prep work before we even get together, so that we're just soliciting from you what were the hardest questions, what are the deepest issues, like what are the highest priority things that you need help with, instead of let's learn everything under the sun about things that you're doing intuitively well.
Yeah, and in fact, over the course of the last month since we decided to do this class, I've told a lot of people, look, you're not ready to do it because you haven't done any of the foundational work. We don't want to teach foundation in this class. That's when you leave people behind. That's when, tracking sort of makes a difference. In this case, what we're saying is generally people in this October class are taking the November test. Some of them are taking January, but most of them are taking November. Everybody has done one of the major sort of foundational prep things. They've done Seven Sage or Demon, or they've read LSAT Trainer, or they've taken a course, or they've done all of Khan Academy. Or they've been working with one of us. They get it. They get what the approach is. This is an opportunity for refinement and from, sort of learning in this group atmosphere where a lot of great information is going to get passed back and forth. So yeah,
this has got me more excited than anything I've done in a long time.
Yeah. It's really great stuff. I got a chat question that I just want to throw out there. It said, is the idea to fully analyze the stimulus and become so good and accurate that it will not require you to critically read all the answer questions following as to not be drawn into the answer choices to save time, or is that too risky? Yes and no. You want to be able to identify the right answer by reading the right answer. but never, ever, ever go through a question and not read the other four, right? Yes, if you identify the right answer, you're going to get huge light bulbs, right? This is the, you know, when we used to pre-phrase sentence completions, the golden ring was that you pre-phrased the thing that was the answer, right? That was the golden ring, right? And in LR, it's the same thing, right? If you can pre-phrase the answer, that's fantastic. It's probably not going to happen. So you want a framework around what do I do with the answer choices, and that is this the same as my pre-phrase? If it is, great, it gets a check mark, and I'm still going to go through the other four, and I'm going to say, no, that's not the same. This is why, you know, using Keith's language, this is how I could improve this question, or this is what this question actually weakens, not strengthens, therefore it's wrong, right? You're running that monologue inside your head anyway. This is an opportunity to do deep confirmation on that process of analyzing answer choices, and the pre-phrase really gets us there to a place where we can be confident about it.
I just talked to some of my small groups about this, so I have some thoughts on that. Like, I think that, you know, while that would be the ultimate goal, I would love it if I could pre-phrase every answer, find it, and be sort of lackadaisical about the others. And to some extent, I do adopt that. What I've talked to my small groups about recently is that there's a pattern I've noticed where wrong answer choices are often wrong for two distinct reasons. And I find this very interesting. One of them is what I call a semantic reason. It has some concept that I think is just not relevant to the flaw, not relevant to what we need to answer the question. And so I'm able to just say, whoa, no, if they're going to say that, no. But then when we peel back the layers in the blind review, what I often find is that even if we fix that semantic issue, we usually still don't have a good answer choice. Right. There is a deeper flaw, a logical flaw to what has been stated. And so I like to think of it as more of a two-pronged attack, that I do use a lot of semantic cues to start to whittle down the work. But at the end of the day, I may reach a situation where there's two answer choices that both contain the necessary concepts that have to be linked together. And I truly am forced to interpret those statements and determine which one makes the correct kind of connection between those two. You know, they're going to be different connections in some way, and I need to find out the nuances of that. So I don't want to say that you can take this shortcut always. It's a shortcut that helps me avoid mental exhaustion. It helps me confirm answer choices that I want to pick. I mean, it has a lot of benefits for me, but refusing to understand deep logic is not an acceptable path forward. Your blind review has to entail that.
Yeah, I think the other piece, and, you know, not to draw too many analogies to other standardized tests, but, you know, those of you who remember back to your SAT or ACT grammar sections, right? You would read and this exists on other tests too, right? You read through the grammar, and there's a flaw in the grammar, and on the ACT, right, there would be the one in the passage, and then there would be, you know, either it's correct as it is, or here are three different versions of it. And so I would tell them to do exactly the same thing. Pre-phrase it. What is the right grammar? Do you know what it is? If you could choose where to put the comma, where would you put it? And then if that answer choice is in the answer choice, is fantastic, right? But if you can't, the other thing that you have to do, as Keith was saying, like, look, I know two of them are wrong, right? I know it's not a dash and it's not a semicolon, but there's got to be a comma. I just don't remember where the comma is supposed to go. You have to compare the answer choices and say, how are these different? Right? They seem the same, but how are they different? What's different about these two things? One says Socrates is a person. The other says people are Socrates. People are Socrates does not connect this circuit for me. Therefore, it's wrong, even though it's got the right two concepts. And obviously that's an oversimplification, but like, you're going to have two really complex ideas in your answer choices. Paraphrase them for yourself, distill them to something that you can talk about fluently, quickly to yourself, so that you can say, this one says this thing, and this one says this thing that's slightly different. Let me go back and reanalyze in the moment and look back at the stimulus and make sure.
You know, just to be clear, on time tests, I absolutely use semantic bases for eliminating things. If they've said a word and I've concluded that that word is problematic, I'm done. I'm not going to really think deeply about what else it means. So in that sense, yes, I take some shortcuts.
Sure.
But also, just to drive the point home, that the shortcuts that I take are highly informed. In other words, my intuition has been developed by not taking the shortcuts, because I'm willing to sit down with Jake and look at the 2007 June prep test over and over after teaching this and taking it and doing all this work with it. That's what's really allowing me to see the connections more quickly.
Sure. I always tell my students, like, I'm not really good at standardized tests because I'm smarter than you. I'm really good at standardized tests because I look at them over and over and over and over again, and then teach them over and over and over and over and over again, and have to reframe them in as many ways as students that I have. And so in explaining them in so many ways, I gain that knowledge too, right? The best way to mastery is through teaching. Before we lose everybody, yes, we will hopefully hold another 12-hour session after the October class. We don't
Holidays.
have it. Yeah, we don't have it scheduled yet, but presuming the next test is your January test, we were talking about doing one in December once, those in college are on winter break. Not that they're actually on campus right now anyway, but whatever. But hopefully we can do a December class so that we can prep for January like we are prepping for November. And then maybe we can run a January class as well. It's going to be sort of it's going to be a bit about demand. We were also talking about, rather than doing it as a 12-hour, we were talking about doing it test by test. So, if there's a demand for saying like, hey, I'd love to get on a schedule with tests up through X, and if you can just advertise which tests you're doing, I'm going to jump in. If we get enough demand, we can do it that way as well. But I'm presuming that there will be another one in December for sure. So
Yeah, I anticipate this will go well, and I would be surprised if we don't do it again. So
yeah. And
I'm hoping
yes,
to.
yeah, for sure. And yes, I will upload the link to this. It takes Zoom a good 3 hours to render the cloud recording. But once they've rendered it all and they give me a link, I'll clean it all up and whatever, and I'll try to upload it tomorrow. So I'll send out that link tomorrow.
Thanks for doing that, Jake.
Yeah, of course. Anybody? I know we've sort of whittled ourselves down to, I think there are 5 of you left.
Nice. If we keep talking, they'll all leave.
Yeah, exactly. Woohoo. Then it'll just be the 2 of us. Does anybody who's still on the call have any particular questions about LR, about circuits, about what we're doing? Feel free to chat it. Feel free to unmute yourself if you want. Any
There was
questions
something I wanted
about
to say and I
anything?
forgot.
Everybody's so quiet tonight.
Jake, I actually have a question.
Sure.
So I know that you're talking about this course that you got coming up, that it's, kind of going off of how you're going to teach it. I've done a couple of courses now, and it has been more lecture based, and not really more about getting us to think. So what is the difference going to be for this course? Because I like to think. Yeah. I want to get that mind going and that hamster wheel going and things like that, because otherwise, if I'm not, I'm just kind of glaze over and I'm not going to take it in. So,
well, one of the things that we're going to do, I'm going to put together a series of Google Forms for each type of section, so that after you've done your timed and blind review, that you can fill out the Google form. These are the ones I got right. These are the ones I got wrong. These are the ones I want to flag for review, and then a notes field, so that I can sort of gather all that data. That'll be number one. And then it's going to depend a little bit on the type of section it is, right? For games, a lot of it's going to be about talking about the merits of certain setups, talking about the merits of certain ways of describing rules. And sort of the big looming question about games is always, do I do the inferences or do I go for gusto with brute force? And so having a little interactivity around that is going to be really important. Generally in classes, right, if you go to unnamed huge publishing company course in a big purple building, you are going to be in a room with 50 to 100 people, and somebody's going to be up at a smart board and they're going to diagram things for you. You'll take notes and you'll be done. We're not doing that. because we're not teaching anything here. Instead, we're reviewing tests and we're reviewing them interactively. We're going to have a group of 10 to 20 people. That's the objective. We don't want any more than that because we want everybody to have a voice, right? So we'll say, okay, we're doing game number 2. It's a linear game. Is there anything weird about this? Ask people to raise hands, people unmute, people chat, right? We're going to get deeply interactive about this. We want this to be about a cumulative effort. I don't know if I've said this tonight. I'm sure I've said it other nights. I approach the LSAT not from having been a lawyer or having gone to law school. I come from a background in pedagogy and a background in education, and specifically in progressive education. And for me, chalk and talk is not the way to learn anything, right? If I get up in front of a board and just diagram stuff, you guys are all passive, and what's the point, right? I want questions, I want input, I want people to work together to come up with the right thing, and I want to be there as a facilitator and a guide toward a better way, because that's the way for you to learn something concretely and learn something in a lasting manner, right? Otherwise, it's just another piece of information, and then you can just read a book for that. You don't need me for that. You go out and spend $50 and you buy the LSAT trainer and you get all that stuff, right? But I need to know what you're thinking. So I'm going to ask you, right? Like, Cora, what are you thinking about this game, right? It's linear, but how are you writing down those rules? Is there a rule there that's weird to you, that's phrased in a weird way? Does anybody have an idea about a way to write that rule in a clear way, right? So that you can go back to it every time and not have to go to the top. That's the kind of interaction we're talking about, rather than just, here's how you diagram it. Here's the perfect way. There is no perfect way. There's no one way. So that's the objective.
Gotcha. And then I know you said this is going to be great for those of us who are taking the November LSAT. With that, do you suggest that, we're doing this course? Should I still be doing 2 or 3 other pre-tests on top?
Well,
I don't want to burn myself out, but I am also
right.
trying to make sure I'm.
So think about this pacing for a second, right? So on a Monday, we're going to be doing a review of the first LR section. So you'll have done it timed and blind sometime over the weekend. Then you'll have our course for an hour, hour and a half, depending on how long you guys stay after we're done, to talk about that. Then on Tuesday, you're going to do timed and blind of the logic games. And on Wednesday, we're going to meet again at 8. And we're going to talk about it for an hour. And on Thursday, you're going to do timed and blind of the other LR section, and we meet on Friday. And then on the weekend, you do timed and blind of the reading section, and then we meet on Monday. So if there's ever an opportunity to do more than what we're already doing, it would be on the weekend days, where you could probably do a little more, especially. Yeah, exactly. Unless, we have lives and families and jobs and whatever. Not that any of us have those things, right? But that would be an opportunity. I would have a hard time believing that you're going to have bandwidth to do any more during the week.
We're going to, really expect a lot. I know I've worked with you, but the triple review is one of the reasons why I was reluctant to teach it for a long time, is that I worried that students would burn out. And I still worry about that. And I try to monitor my students very carefully. And when they are willing to trust me about the efficiency of blind review, what I do for them when I'm working with them privately, and we'll try to do our best with the group too, is that when I see that they're overworking, I really try to pressure them to back off. I think there is a rate at which you can learn new things, and I don't know that you can hack that easily. And I've seen a lot of people try. I've seen people tell me, I'm going to do 8 hours a day. I promise. I'm a hard worker. I've done it before. I mean, I've heard everything. I've seen very, very few people who can internalize more than maybe 2 prep tests a week. That would be like someone who's not working and studying full time. Otherwise, 1 prep test a week is really the right pace. And for some people who are working and going to school and raising family, even that's too much. So I think that you're really better off studying the exam deeply, not broadly. It doesn't do you any good to do 30 prep tests if you haven't learned if you're making the same mistake over and over again. In fact, it's really silly.
Yeah, Brad said something really insightful on the Facebook group the other day. He said, you know, a lot of us will go through doing prep tests or doing, I mean, really with anything, right? We do this with sports, we do this with everything, where we seek out that one moment where we do it better, and we use that as an indicator of success, of improvement. But in the moments where we do abnormally worse, where we have an anomalous worse score, well, we write that one off as anomalous. But the one that's better is indicative of improvement, which means that what our tendency is to continually measure ourselves, seeking out that one time when it goes better so that we can feel better about our improvement. And so that's a force that's counter to the kind of work that actually does breed improvement. Right? So we have to reduce the temptation to keep measuring ourselves. Oh, maybe if I take a test today, I'll get my 162, which is the thing that I've always wanted. Even though I've been getting 155s, 155, 155, 155. And if that's true, and you really do get that 162, do you think that the next day you're going to go take an LSAT and you're going to get a 162? No, it's not going to happen. The guy who taught me LSATs those many years ago, a guy who, wildly brilliant guy who had been at Bell Labs and then started tutoring. His name was Joe Avalone. He was crazy. But he was brilliant with the LSAT. He said, there are a lot of platitudes in my teaching from him, but one of them is that when it comes to the LSAT, the score that you're going to get on the official is going to be somewhere in and around the 80th percentile of all of the full practice tests you've taken. Which means one anomalous super high score does not mean that that's where you are right now. Statistics doesn't bear out that way, right? The middle 67% is one standard deviation from the mean, right? And that's the most likely scenario, is that that's where we'll be. But we have to trail off things that are older, right? So we can push that forward a little bit. But it's going to be in that 75th, 80th percentile kind of place.
You know what? Oh,
yeah.
You want to go?
Hi, Jake. Hi, Keith. Hi.
Hey, Leanie.
I have a question. Jake, you said something that kind of struck me. You said that if we need to get a foundation, we may not want to take this upcoming session. And I'm not testing again until January, February. So I want to say reestablish some foundation. So I think, are you saying the best thing for me to do is to go ahead and, get a foundation again after I've taken the LSAT and didn't do too well, and then take the course, the next time around?
I mean, Keith likely knows this better than I do. Keith knows you, but I would say that if you've taken the LSAT already, you've read some of the books, you've watched Khan Academy, you've seen some of the videos, you know how to approach a game, you know how to approach LR, you're just not doing as well as you want to do, then this is completely appropriate for you. The issue is, I don't want somebody who's saying like, oh, I'm starting off my LSAT journey today and I plan to take it next August and I'm going to take your course. We're like, no, this is not the time for you to take this course. You don't need to be doing this right now. You need to be reading LSAT Trainer. You need to be reading Loophole. You need to be watching some videos. You need to be spending 2 weeks looking only at the June 2007 test and pick it apart 8 ways from Sunday. This is the time for you to do that. If you're taking it in January, you've prepped the test before, you've taken it before, and you need a framework, you need some accountability around doing triple review the right way, this is a great opportunity for you to do that. And to be around some really, the people that have signed up so far, we've got some really great people, some people at all varying levels in terms of the outputs, but really interesting and smart people who are going to contribute to your learning, and you're going to be able to contribute to their learning. I think it's great. And frankly, not to sell ourselves out of our own work, but this is the best use of $300 in terms of LSAT prep that I can think of. There's nothing like this out there. I have a student who's prepping November right now. He took August. And he said he spent $1,000 on a prep test course, test prep course that was so bad that he's now in litigation to try to get his money back because they could not deliver the product. It was $1,000. Right? And that's not the most expensive thing out there, right? There are tons of these digital courses with instructors who, are hired fly by night, who don't know what they're doing. And you've got, not to toot my horn, I'll toot Keith's horn and Keith can toot mine, but Keith has been doing this for 20 years, right? And he was a professor at UT Austin and taught for major companies, but has developed his own systems and he's really good at what he does, but he's also broadly intelligent and brings a lifetime of experience and intelligence about other things into this. So it's not deeply narrow the way that some things can be. I think that's hugely valuable. And you don't get access to somebody like that for $300. You get it for $50,000 of law school tuition. So that's, that's really something. So the answer quickly, Zini, is yes, this is for you.
Jake, this Zini's situation is really interesting to me because she's frustrated with her score, and I've gotten together with her several times, and every time I do, I am amazed at how thoroughly she has memorized the strategy books. She can tell you question types. She can tell you what is the right strategy to apply to those question types. I mean, the low-hanging fruit where I typically go with a student and say, oh, I can help you real quick. I couldn't go there with her. She knew everything. And so she's a perfect candidate for this. And I know several other people on this call have done $1,000 courses and have knowledge of what's on the exam, but don't have a method to execute. And so I'm really looking forward to this. I hope you'll do it, Zini.
Yeah. Those of you who know me know that I love my sports analogies, and we talk sports all the time. You can't learn a sport in the classroom, and you can't learn it by watching videotape. Right? You can't sit at home on the couch and pretend to know what it means to coach a football team. You just can't, right? And you can't sit there and say, well, there's Tiger Woods trying to hit his 8-iron from 170 yards. What an idiot. He should have done this other thing. That's not actually learning, right? That's being fed information. It's the application of that information, Zini, that's really the important part. And doing it systematically like this in a controlled environment is the way. It is the way to improve. But it's why last week we were talking about PowerScore, and I'm not speaking ill of PowerScore at all. I think PowerScore has done an amazing job of analyzing these 93 LSATs that we have and compiling this compendium of information. But they are an encyclopedia. That's all they are. And they don't give you a way to synthesize the information into something actionable, right? You can design the perfect golf swing. You can design exactly what to do to run a 2-hour marathon, but you have to be able to do it, and you have to be able to execute it. And so just being given the information isn't enough. You need to figure out how to embody it, how to put it in your body. You hear me talk about paraphrase all the time, right? The reason I talk about paraphrase is that the only way to answer a question is to do it in your language, which means every time we read something, we translate it. We translate it into our own language, into our own understanding. And, there are good tutors out there that have good curricula. There are good books out there with good curricula. But the great tutors, the great systems, the things that really get you are the ones that help you to find your vocabulary and your method and your way forward to really master the test.
Jake,
Yeah,
let me say one thing, Sandra. Zini,
yeah,
I've been working with her for a while. We haven't met very many times. We started meeting, maybe it's been probably more than 60 days since our first meeting. And this is really one of the motivations for me to partner with Jake, because I think Zini is so intelligent, and I just can't meet with her often enough to make the impact that I want to make. And so I started thinking about how in the world can I figure out a way to make this less expensive for people so that I can have a bigger impact. And this was one of the things that Jake and I came up with. I've talked to a bunch of tutors. I've thought about partnering with many of them, and we had such a similar philosophy and wanted to accomplish similar things. And so this was really with you in mind. I mean, not in an abstract way. I mean, literally, I did this because of the students that I had met on Facebook who I just was pricing out, and I didn't like it. I didn't like the way it felt to see these people not getting the help they needed. And so, yeah, we're doing this for you.
Sandra, you had a question?
Yeah, all I wanted to say was I just wanted to, well, I concur with Cora also, because if I wasn't sure about joining this course, I am totally sure tonight. And the reason why I want to say that is because, you know, like I shared that analogy about swimming last week and like your sports analogies, Jake. I have just been learning concepts ad nauseum. And I even took one of those very expensive prep courses where a lady was on the board, you know, writing a bunch of chicken shit, and I couldn't make 2 cents of it, excuse my French. But I'm just been utter frustrated because it's just, until I had Brandon Cohen, I felt really good about that. I'm doing really good in the logic games. It's just the application is being able to synthesize everything, these concepts. And I feel really good about this. This is just like, I need the homework. I need the structure. I think it's really important too. And I just want to say that not only is it affordable for a lot of people, because times are tough now. Times are really tough. And we're in the middle of a pandemic, whether some people don't think we are. And I think having this connection is really important, and it's been good for me. And matter of fact, today I've been doing the blind review like what you did, and I've done my 3rd one, and on my untimed I have been not doing under 50%, and I only missed 2 on prep test 77.
That's awesome.
You.
It was untimed, okay, but I analyzed like you're telling me to. And I wasn't sure if you guys have a certain, because I'm putting some notebooks together for that 3 process. So I wasn't sure if you guys had a process that you recommend, or even special forms. Or we just kind of define our own system? I mean,
I won't speak for Keith. For me, and again, this is not a comment on anybody else's approach. If I were to give you a form to follow, then you would just follow it, and you would do it without any critical eye on it. There would be no criticality to it. Instead, you would just go through it. I forget whether this was last week. I was talking about quantitative versus qualitative assessment.
yeah.
I don't remember. So, right, like if I give you a number and I say, well, this is how you did, well, then you won't actually do any analysis. And similarly, if I give you a framework for note taking, then you're just going to follow the framework, and you're not going to think, you're going to do it mindlessly. And that's not a comment on you. That's the nature of the game. If you have to create your own system of notes and then hand it over and say, here's my thinking, right? This is what we were saying earlier. Here's my thinking. Right? I'd be like, great, that's great, but you're not talking about this part, you're not talking about this part. So next time you do it, try to incorporate those things. Okay, fine. And then you go away and you do it, and you come back and you've done all those things, but then you left something else out, and then we nudge you a little bit the other way, and then we get you there. But instead of it being, this is my psychiatrist mother talking, right? I can't tell you how you feel. I can't tell you what your problems are. I have to ask you really good and insightful questions based on my experience, and get you to realize it yourself. That's the only way you're going to learn.
I hear you. Thank you for clarifying.
Thanks for the question.
Oh, I'm sorry. One last thing. I'm going to go get this chicken out of it. I just enjoyed this. I just wanted to mention to you ladies both, if you're on the fence, like you were saying, don't be. When I first started, I'm a veteran. I did the Army, Navy, and the Air Force. Yes, I did all.
You.
And so my mind is really hardcore driven. And I haven't been in education since 2011. And when I first started out, I think I was doing it wrong, and someone told me about Keith. And so what you're going to get with Keith, I haven't worked with Jay, but what I know with Keith is what you're going to get. He's going to make you think. So it's not going to be, okay, well, A is to B. He's going to say, okay, well, you do have the right answer, but why? Tell me why. He wants to know why, even if you get it right, why? And in my mind, when I first started with him, I was irritated on why he wanted to know why if I got the answer right. Because in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, I got it right, so let's move on. No, he wanted to know, okay, you got it right, but why? Tell me why, you know? And after I got off the phone with him, agitated, because that's the army in me, I said, you know what? That's who I want to teach. That's who I want teaching me. I want somebody to challenge me. I want, okay, yeah, you got the right answer, but do you know why you got that answer? Because the next one may not be that way. And then him and I spent, I think, like 20 minutes on this one question, and we were going back and back. I had the right answer, but again, he was like, why? Why? And you know, so you're gonna get that, ladies, if that's what you want. I haven't worked with Jay, but I like the way you explain. So I see he's the brain. I'm not saying you're not the brain, but I see he's the mechanics, and you're the explanatory portion of it. So that's what I'm getting here.
Yeah,
So that's what you're gonna get, ladies.
And I love that framework, and I love that idea of why. It's one of the things that, you know, I don't know if you guys know, in addition to teaching LSATs, like I said, I teach all kinds of standardized tests. I've also done a lot of math education with younger kids, you know, 10 through high school, and design curriculum. And so one of the most important things in modern curriculum for math, you know, if you guys have heard about this thing with Common Core, there's a lot of bad information out there about Common Core. And a lot of people say a lot of bad things about it. And most of the reason they say bad things about it is because when we were taught math, we were taught it really poorly, right? We were taught, here's your algorithm, here's how you solve the problem, do it right, here's your formula, good, move on. And now math education, I have a 7-year-old, I have a 4-year-old, second grade and pre-K. And the math that they do is deeply conceptual. And so at every turn, it doesn't matter if you get the right answer. What matters is that you can demonstrate it. So when I've got a middle school kid, I've got a high school kid, and they get the right answer to a word problem, I say, yeah, you told me it was 4. How'd you get there? Right? The reason your teacher asks to see your work is not because your work matters. It's because your work demonstrates that you understand the concept. And that's all we care about. We don't care about the right answer. And especially on a standardized test, you can guess the right answer 1 out of 5 times. So I don't know what you did. Right? And really good research around standardized testing says that multiple choice is literally the worst way to assess anything, but it's what we've got, right? And so because it's what we've got, we as tutors need to make sure that you're not just getting there because, well, I kind of fudged it. Forget that. Last week, I had a really good interaction. I don't remember whether it was you, Sandra, or it was somebody else, but I was saying to them, like, look, on a day when you're analyzing wrong answers, you can learn as much from your right answers as your wrong answers. That's why we do blind review. Because if we don't do blind review and we ignore the right answers and only focus on the ones we got wrong, we don't learn any of the positive results. We don't reinforce the things that we learned last week, right? What if 2 weeks ago we got a weekend question wrong, and then we saw nearly the same kind of weekend question this week and we got it right? If we don't remember the thing that we changed to get it right, we're not going to get it right the next week, right? We have to reinforce those positive lessons. That's why Keith asked why over and over and over again, because getting it right isn't good enough. You got to know
That's
why
why I want you guys to do blind review. I want you to repeat the questions you got right, not just the ones you get wrong, because I want you to reinforce those correct strategies as well.
Yeah, I had a great session today. I was telling Keith this before you guys all got on. I had a great session today about games, and I came across this game on Test 80, which is it's a brutal game if you guys have done Test 80. There's this one about buildings and real estate companies that own buildings, and they're trading their buildings with each other. And the last time I did it, I just sort of brute forced all the iterations, and I got the answers, and I moved on. And this time around, this guy was asking me, like, what's up with this game? I got to come up with something better. I don't get it. And, you know, this is probably my 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th time through this game. And suddenly I had a new idea. And my new idea was what I'm calling a valuation framework, right? I've placed value on things. It's very mathematical. But then I started getting this idea, like, wait a minute, are there other games this works for? And you start making connections. It doesn't matter if you got it right the last time. You do it again, you have a new framework of understanding. Go apply it to other things. See where the connections are. I've said so much this week. Stop thinking about the ways things are different. Start thinking about the ways that they're the same. How is reading comp the same as LR? How are games the same as LR? How are different games similar to each other? Right? If anybody's done LSAT trainer, Mike keeps saying, right, if you break down every question type you're going to get to the point where you're literally going to have a different question type for every question on the test. That's not valuable because you're looking for patterns. That's not good for you. You don't want 100 question types. You want like 4 question types. Because if you can have 4 question types with 4 approaches, well, then you know what you're doing every time, right? So
I think
you're
it's
looking for
funny too,
similarity.
because if you memorize question types, it's good. I do believe that is a valuable thing to do. But boy, if they change the language at all,
Yeah.
what are you going to do?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. It's like, you know, I mean, in a team sport, right? What good is it if you're a basketball team and you prepare for only like 2 or 3 offenses from the other team, and then they come at you with something new? You have to be flexible, right? You have to build skills that make you flexible. You're not going to know every question's different. Every LR is different, right? So you need to be flexible in that way. We're building those skills by doing it over and over again.
Bye, Zini. It's late. I think we should let everyone off the hook.
Geez, it's been 2 hours.
Bye, everybody.
Good night.
Bye,
Thanks for
Zini.
coming.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, it's bedtime.
Yeah, it's totally bedtime.
We should start these earlier.
Yes.
I mean, if you get an idea, Keith and Jake, as far as the time zones of everybody, is there a possibility you can start early? Because I'm on East Coast.
I mean, I am too. I'm in New York.
I'm in
The problem is that we've got a lot of people on wacko schedules, right? Like we've got some West Coast people who are like, I get off of work at 5. Like, I'm not going to make it by 8. You know, I would love to do these in the morning, you know, especially with people working from home. If there are ways to like work out work schedules, you know, that I would love to be able to find some morning times too. This was just sort of something, the first couple of people that we got, 8 p.m. Eastern worked for them. And so that was sort of arbitrary, but that's part of the reason why I like the idea of just sort of doing it a test at a time. Like, hey, we're going to do 4 sessions of this test. Who wants in for $100 or something?
Yeah, and we can change the times up since we're not, you know, wedded with such a large group for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm on the
we're
West
working
Coast,
on it.
and I'm willing to change. I mean, I'm willing to be flexible. So I'm on the West Coast, but
I
yeah.
still have some daylight.
It's
Like
amazing.
pitch black here.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but
totally.
the fires are terrible here. So yeah.
Are you in Northern Cal?
I'm not, but even in San Diego, we have a lot of, like last night I took a 2-mile walk and I actually had a problem last night. I couldn't believe it. So, you know, and I didn't even think when I first started, I was having no problem at all. And then I walked the day before and I was fine. And then last night I was going like, this is awful.
Yeah. I mean, the smoke hit New York this morning.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Wow.
We've
Yeah.
got a hurricane going on right now in Atlanta.
If you're not having hurricanes, you're having fires, you're having, yeah.
Holy moly.
Fantastic. Wait, the hurricane hit Atlanta?
Well, it's basically, so it was in Florida yesterday. And so all the big top is in Atlanta right now. So we've got the wind, the rain, all of that. So not like hurricane force in like you get in Florida, but we're getting it's like sitting on top of Atlanta right now.
I got to check on my in-laws. My in-laws are north of Atlanta. See how they're doing. Well, fantastic, guys. Thank you so much for sticking it out with us. And Keith and I.
Thanks, everybody.
Sure.
Be safe, everybody. Okay.
Yeah, you guys too. And let us know if you need anything.
Thank you.
Good
Thank
night.
you so much. Thank you.
Good night, guys.
Bye.